Hey, everybody, it's Brett, and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Stack, where today I am sitting down with this author who 2 years ago I discovered her first book, which was her debut. Actually, it was the audiobook. And as I say in the interview, it was one of those books that so attached itself to me and the time and place that I was reading it. But I was so blown away by this story and desperately wanted to talk to her about it at the time. So when I found out that she had a new book coming out, I absolutely for sure wanted to have her on the show. Her new book is Disappoint Me. The author is Nicola Dinan. She is truly a fantastic writer. A little bit about Nicola. Her debut, Bellies, won the Polari First Book Prize, was shortlisted for the Diverse Book Awards, and was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award, and was longlisted for the Gordon Byrne Prize and Brooklyn Public Library Book Prize. She grew up in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur and currently lives in London. So I hope you enjoy this episode of Behind the Stack. I had started to say, I'm so grateful to be sitting here with you because there are certain books that you read. I've talked about this before, that I feel like wherever you are, whatever you're doing at that time, somehow they stick in your head and they resonate for whatever reason. And so it kind of sears the location of where you are when you read it. And that happened with me with your first book, Bellies. And I was in Ohio. I had been taking my son to college and I was alone. And I don't even know how. I think the audiobook had been sent to me. And so I thought, well, I'm going to try this. And I was so captivated and I was so moved. And I felt like I have to tell everybody about this book. And it was such an incredible and an insured debut that I couldn't believe this was the first book.
Thank you.
And I really was just like, at the time I was doing the Gaze Reading podcast, and it was almost like too late, the timing of it. But I was watching you and watching, this book kind of explode. And I was like, I wanted to talk to you so badly. And so when they said your next book was coming out, I was just so excited. And I was like, I have to sit down with her. I have to meet her, just because I don't know. I don't always have that reaction. And yet, I'm so thrilled also that to say, like, this is as good, if not better, than Bellies. And it, again, there's no sophomore slump. It's just another fantastic and smart and insightful book. I said about Bellies, it kind of hit into the zeitgeist of what it is right now to be young and that whole world. And I think you captured it again with this. And you are one of those writers to me who is, dare I say, almost ahead of their time, because you are capturing these moments and these feelings and these characters that I think are so necessary and fresh and needed. So anyway, I'm going to stop gushing now, but just to say congratulations. I'm thrilled you're here.
Well, thank you so much. That was all incredibly flattering. So, always a nice way to start a conversation. I'm so happy that you found Bellies to begin with. I think Bellies had what maybe I would describe as a quieter release in the US, maybe in particular compared to the UK. And so I'm always really happy when I see American readers who've managed to find it or pick it up at the bookshop.
Yeah, I mean, and if I'm being blunt, like, I hated the American cover, and like I
Oh,
actually went
yeah.
and I got the UK cover
Did you?
because, first of all,
Wow.
I loved this cover so much, and I wanted a signed copy, but also because I felt like the American cover, and I understand this is probably a challenge. It wasn't representative of what the book really was, and it painted it to me as some kind of, Emily Henry rom-com. Not that there's anything wrong with Emily Henry. I just think it didn't capture the essence of the book. So I thought, even the marketing of it, I thought, this is incorrect. Like, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of it based on this kind of, cutesy primary colored book. So that was another reason for me. I mean, it was like I had it as one of my top 10 books of the year, and I pushed and will continue to push it just because I think it's so good and
Thank you.
much like this. So before we dive into the new book, I had some like curious questions about you just personally. So you grew up in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur.
I did.
And did you always want to be a writer, or is this something that kind of came later for you?
I always enjoyed writing. I think when I think about my sort of teen years and early 20s, I was sort of like a serial quitter. Or rather, actually, no, let's phrase that in a more positive light. I tried a lot of things that weren't quite right for me. I moved to the UK when I was 18. My dad's family are British. And I moved for university and I studied science of all things. And then very quickly realized that that wasn't for me, particularly, sure, science and theory, science and practice, like, being in the lab and having to
Mm.
put things into pipettes. I'm terrible with my hands. I'm not a careful person, very physically clumsy. And so I realized I can't do this. And so I started to look towards the humanities and ended up, specializing in the history and philosophy of science. And then I graduated and decided, okay, I'll be a lawyer. And so I did a sort of a law conversion law degree and then trained as a lawyer and worked at a corporate law firm for a few years. And then also during that time had this sort of sense of dread of just knowing that the life I'd chosen and put it a number of years into was just not for me at all. But around that time, I was really thinking about what have I always enjoyed doing?
Mm.
And ever since I was a teenager, I've been writing short stories, and I have a best friend from Malaysia called Aisha, and all throughout our teenage years and also our 20s, we were sending each other bits of creative writing. And I think despite that being the only thing I've consistently loved doing, it never really struck me that I could be a writer until I got older, and in my mid 20s, and had a bit more of a sense of the possibilities that life actually has outside of the narrow set of things which I had prescribed for myself. And I think when I was younger, and for a lot of my early 20s, I fell into the trap that a lot of people do, which is I fell in love with the idea of doing things. So I fell in love with, like, oh, isn't it cool to like be a scientist? And oh, maybe it's really, I love the idea of myself as a lawyer. And I think I failed to pay a lot of attention to the verb, the sciencing, the lawyering. But, the verb I think I've always been able to be on board with is writing. And so when I started writing Bellies, I gave myself the permission to call myself a writer. So this was when I was 26, about 5 years ago. And from then, it became so clear to me that this is what I wanted to do. And the moment I knew for sure, and the moment I quit my job as a lawyer, was when I'd finished what might have been the first or second draft of Bellies. And I asked myself, what am I going to do if this novel doesn't work out? And the answer came to me in a second, which was, I'll write another book. And
Wow.
that was the moment where I was like, okay, this is something I have to take a leap of faith with and give myself the space to fully explore. And so I'd had some savings, I quit my job, and I dedicated 6 months intensely to editing Bellies, during which time I found an agent and we sent it out to publishers. And then I had a book deal and I knew, okay, well, this career can sort of be real now.
Wow. But the early drafts of everything, you were doing this all on your own, correct? There was nobody looking over your shoulder. There was no one revising for you, correct?
Well, I was really lucky. Firstly, yes, you're right. Like, ultimately, no one does the writing but you. But I actually had joined a writing workshop. And so, what was
Mm.
amazing was that I was forced in a peer group to share my work from a very early stage of the novel. I was probably halfway through my first draft when I joined this course with 15 other writers, a couple of whom I'm still really close to. And it meant that I got used to the idea of exposure quite quickly. And began that tricky process of letting go of perfectionism, which is a necessary part of receiving criticism and also in sharing your work with other people. And so, yeah, it was alone and then it wasn't. I think, writing is something which is inevitably solitary. That's kind
Sure.
of why I do it. I love not having to engage with much else than the work I'm doing, compared to sort of being in an office environment where everyone seems to be asking me for things that I don't actually want to do. But there's something wonderfully solitary about being a writer. But there's also, at the most critical points in your writing, you do have to engage with other people. And I
Yeah.
learned that lesson quite early on.
And how was it for you, having gone through that experience, kind of letting go? You've created this piece of art and then you have to put it out there. And then the experience becomes bigger than you, right? Because it's a shared experience. Are you someone who could go back and look at something? Or is it, I always liken it to actors who say, I never want to watch myself on screen. I never want to see that performance. Do you feel that? Or do you feel like, once it's out and on to the next?
I mean, I don't think I even wait for the first book to be out to move to the next thing. I
Which I
feel
love.
like I'm at the stage of my life, I'm 31, and I'm feeling like I'm in the time of my life in which I can produce a lot of work, because
Mm.
I'm sort of living without the constraints that I might have sort of later on in my life. And so I'm sort of, at the moment, I feel like I have 3 books on the go. We're having this conversation about book 2. I've written my 3rd book, which is currently with my editor. I'm waiting for comments. And then in the meantime, I'm writing book 4. And so there's a real sense of, okay, I'm moving on to the next thing. A, because, girls got to eat. So, I have to write these books. But 2, because I love it. And there's a sense of, okay, what frees me from sort of the anxiety that this book isn't going to perform in the way that I hope? What frees me from that terror of things not going quite right? And I find that the solution to that is always reminding myself that there are more words in the well. I can always return to it and write something new, and the possibilities are sort of endless in terms of what I can create. And I think we see a lot of that journey in Max and Disappoint Me. We start the book and we meet her. She sort of would describe herself as a failed poet, although, of course, the book sort of challenges what her notions of what failure means.
Mm.
And she's really struggling to reconnect to creativity, having published a book of poetry, which is poorly received critically, and feeling as if this sort of venture in which she took a lot of risk to achieve was sort of for nil. And I think in waiting for Bellies to be published, I was going through similar feelings of anxiety, of not quite knowing how I would move on. Again, I said the moment I quit my job was when I knew I would write another book, but that was still so far away from publication. And so when publication actually came, I started to feel that terror. And I was like, will I actually be able to carry on writing if this doesn't work out? And I did learn that the best way to sort of cure that was to really re-engage with the verb. Like I said, and
Mm.
the last question that you asked, I think the best thing for me is always to remove myself from the idea of something, the idea of being a successful author, and connect with the fact that I actually do just quite like writing.
Yeah. I saw you were talking in another interview, and so I had to ask you this, where you said, you're talking about the book cliche of the first book you write is the book you have to write, and the second is the book you want to write. And so at the time you had said, Bellies was really that book you had to write. And so do you think it's followed suit? Was Disappoint Me the book you wanted to write?
It's so funny. Whenever someone is like, oh, I've read, someone interviewing me refers to another interview, I'm flushed with a wave of dread because I'm like, what did I say?
Are you?
And
Is it the
also,
moment before, like, you said this, and I'm going to tell you what you
yeah,
said?
but even sometimes, in the heat of the moment of the interview, sometimes you just say things kind of spontaneously that you look
Yes.
back on, you're like, maybe, do I even think that?
Right.
But I think, I think Disappoint Me felt, I don't necessarily think that I didn't want to write Bellies. I felt like I've wrote it with a real sense of urgency. And I think that's reflected in almost the tone of the book. It's filled
Mm.
with these characters in their early 20s who are sort of approaching life life with sort of all these extreme emotions. Like they're
Mm.
laughing, they're crying, they're experiencing almost like the full complement of human emotions for their first time in their lives as they sort of
Yes.
traverse those years of their early 20s. And I think that's sort of, when I think of the word had, I think that's where the urgency comes from. Not so much that I felt like it's a book I had to get out of me, although in some
I,
senses I did, but I think the book itself is quite urgent, or rather the book reflects that urgency with which I wrote it. I think naturally with the second book, I wasn't in a situation that I was trying to get out of. And what I mean by that is when I wrote Bellies, part of that urgency and feeling of had to was born out of the fact that I was working a job I hated and I wanted to not do a
sure.
job I hated and find a career that I found really meaningful. And when I started writing Disappoint Me, I had more space. I had a bit more of a sense of where my future would go. And so I think that meant that I was also a bit more contemplative in
Mm.
writing it. And I think that's also reflected in the tone of the novel as well. And I think that sort of also reflects the time of life that we find the characters in Disappoint Me. It's interesting because Bellies was very much a retrospective exercise. How do I make sense of my early 20s as someone in my mid 20s? Disappoint Me was sort of the opposite. How might I see my life transform in the next few years as I approach my 30s? And so there's sort of a deflatedness that you find in the characters at the start of Disappoint Me, where they're sort of just a bit jaded. And I think you can imagine the characters in Bellies sort of feeling that way once they reach their 30s, even though the novels aren't sort of connected. I always describe them as sort of spiritual sequel, or rather I describe Disappoint Me as a spiritual sequel to Bellies. What is this next stage of life holding for them? And that is a stage of life which is sort of a period of life where you're not motivated by had tos and sense of urgency. You're actually kind of, well, in some sense you are, but you're also really questioning what it is that you want in terms of the life you want to build. Not sort of the chaos of being in your early 20s. You're out of that, and when you're out of that, you're sort of just left with yourself. And there's a question of, where does my life go? How do I want to conform to the expectations that are placed on me as a woman, and particularly a trans woman navigating a heteronormative world? These sort of bigger questions that are less to do with identity and with more to do with how one chooses to live.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, because I said right when I was putting notes together, this feels to me, like you said, it's not a sequel in any way, but it feels almost as if in some person's journey where they would be at this point in their life, with the launch off being Bellies, and then here we are, say 5 years later, and existing. So this is a perfect time, I think, to, like, if you would mind, do you have an elevator pitch for Disappoint Me?
Yeah, I do. Well, okay. Well, how many words is an elevator pitch? Is my or
Well,
what's
you
the?
can. But I always said we can be in a tall building, or it could be a
Mhm.
townhouse. Do you know what I mean? It's really up to
Okay,
you. I'm not going to be
let's
like,
go
oh,
pretty tall.
okay, yeah, take it.
So, Disappoint Me follows a trans woman named Max. She's 30 and she falls down the stairs at a New Year's Eve party, wakes up in hospital, and her first thought is, I'm gonna find a boyfriend. Is this the death of feminism? And she enters into a very convenient heteronormative partnership with a British Chinese man called Vincent. And their relationship is propelled into greater seriousness by a number of health issues surrounding them. But the novel is also told from Vincent's perspective, and not in the present, but his 2012 gap year in Thailand, where he travels around with his best friend Fred and meets a gorgeous traveler named Alex. And through these two timelines, we see relationships in one time echoing into the future, and contemplate what it means to reconcile with our past selves and the ugliest parts of our histories.
Excellent, and we've arrived.
And we've arrived on the 150th floor.
No, it really wasn't that long at all. It was. So, what was was there one thing that was the initial inspiration for you that keyed off this idea?
So it was definitely born out of, I was 27 when I started writing Disappoint Me, and I was looking around me and sensing that there was a shift in the air. People were talking about relationships with greater gravity.
Mm,
Heterosexual people were referring to their boyfriends and girlfriends as their partners, talking about the future 1 year away became talking about the future 5 years away. Some people I know were even falling pregnant. And there was a real sense at which life was moving ahead. And I and so many of the women around me were struck with a feeling of how are we going to be at the party for too long? You know, are the lights
mm.
going to come on at 6 a.m. and we're going to look around and no one's there? And we're there, ratty hair, sweaty, lost our keys, no way to get home. So that was, that was where I started writing the book. And I write from the perspective of a trans woman, both from my own perspective and that of Max's in the novel. But it was a feeling of that I was really observing in all of the women around me, cis or trans, and the anxieties of how do I fit into the expectations that are being placed on me as I move into the next stage of life. And, there was almost a feeling of having spent our days as liberated women chasing what we wanted, building our careers. And suddenly, as we approached 30, the tone changed. And it was much more, okay, well, like, are you dating anyone? Or, is it serious? Like, do you think you'll get married? And that's quite terrifying. And suddenly, all of these things that I spent my 20s building up felt less important in the context of the security of a romantic relationship. And so that was where it really started. And I think that's why the book is sort of, I think, pitched as an exploration of heteronormativity, but through the eyes of a trans woman.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because I was thinking about this whole idea of Max and the normativity. A lot of
You got there.
I did eventually because I also, this is because I think this has always existed because I always think of, in the queer community, even when I remember when in the States, when gay marriage was becoming legalized and so many people saying, well, I'm like, why am I going to subscribe to that? Why am I going to do that? So I think it's such a prevalent thing that exists of always, how much do you subscribe to something? How much do you give into something? And how much does almost society just beat you down with everything that it's giving you to say, well, but this is the thing you want, right? You want to find your partner, you want to get married, you want to, have children and have that dream of the white picket fence and the school and the kids going off and the dog and all of those kind of things that you subscribe to. Here you have this character who in many ways, like many in the queer community, who were going to rebel against it and say, but is that actually what I want? Coupled
Mm-hmm.
with, but is it also really comforting?
Absolutely. And, I always think about the success of the gay marriage movement and how sort of the ideal image of sort of a gay couple to sort of sell the idea of gay marriage was sort of a two white gay men with their dog with a suburban home. And it's like, look, they're just like us. And, there's a real sense of the ways in which queer people have bartered for acceptance is through assimilation. And, we see that on racial lines as well. And I think,
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated by that idea because, though I think what Max finds is that though she may assimilate into a heteronormative world, she also feels this deep sense of alienation from it, both in terms of its promises and its expectations. And I think those things often come in hand. The promises are given in exchange for certain expectations being met. And I think she sort of has to confront that whilst also feeling quite alienated from the queer world that she inhabits in London, which is, much less concerned with revolutionary potential than it is with sort of appearing at the right events and seeming a certain type of cool. And those things which maybe she held a huge sense of or placed a huge amount of importance on in her 20s no longer means as much in her 30s. And yet that's how she's identified with her queerness during that time. And so what does it mean for her to fall down the stairs at a New Year's Eve party and really want to pull away from a world which she doesn't think necessarily serves her anymore? But that doesn't necessarily dispel her own queerness. And I think
Right.
we witness in the novel these tensions between, these feelings of desire and alienation that often are directed at the exact same thing. And I think, Max, as a trans woman who transitioned a large number of years before the start of the novel, is sort of lived her medical transition with the aim of assimilation. And here it is, you have the nice boyfriend who seems accepting of you, and everyone sees you as mostly just a cishet couple, just like everyone else. I think she doesn't find as much peace in that as she had hoped. And I think, as a writer, what's interesting for me is that I'm often described as writing love stories. I've seen Disappoint Me
Mm.
described as a love story. Bellies, I've seen described as a love story. And I find that so interesting because I see my books as being maybe part of a larger project of the deprioritization of romantic love. I think
Mm.
in many ways, Bellies is more a breakup novel than it is a
Yeah.
classical love story. And in some ways, yes, Max and Vincent's relationship is sort of the focal point of the novel, but almost it functions as a way to bring other aspects of their character to the fore rather than focusing on the love. And I don't think the lesson is that romantic love is going to save Max. Rather, what she learns is how to approach it with this greater sense of realism for what it can do for her.
Sure. And I also think what you said too is, it's like the careful what you wish for,
Mm-hmm.
because I think this really resonated with me last night as I was going back through this idea of identity and assimilation. And for someone like Max, who, like you said, had transitioned, so she's very much in her life, and for all observers, for the most part, she probably just goes through her life appearing as a cisgendered heterosexual woman. But I think, again, this really resonated with me as a queer person, because what's happening right now in the trans community is we all know is the exact same thing that has happened previously years and years ago with the gay community, and then it moved into gay marriage, and now we're trans. It's like, who is the enemy in terms of sexuality and gender and all of that thing, which is so horrifying. But I remember being early on as a gay person, you always used to say, well, gay is not my whole identity. I'm so much more than just being gay. And the irony of all that is, like, I keep looking at that now and think, but it's exactly what my identity is. Sure, I'm more than my sexuality, but at the same time, it's exactly what identifies me. It's exactly what gives me my point of view. There used to be that question that I remember years and years and years ago, friends would say, if you could take a pill and change yourself with one pill, would you do it? And I unequivocally always would say, well, no, because this is me. This is a part of my identity. And there's a passage when she talks about it in here where she says, if I'm not performing queerness, if what I'm perceived to be is just a woman and one who isn't trans or gay, then where does identity really take me? What cause does it serve? And I was like, wow, that's it exactly. I mean, it's staying true to yourself while also, is it finding the happily ever after, but on what terms? I don't know. And you've also created with Vincent this guy who's so appealing. I mean, he really is like Prince Charming. There's nothing about him that you would be like, well, he's fantastic. He's handsome. He's sensitive, which is also why I love what you've done with the narrative. And did you know going into this that you were always going to have this past for him that was kind of going to be in conversation with the present?
I think the moment I decided to include Vincent's chapters when he's traveling in Thailand, which was relatively early on in drafting the novel, that was the moment it stopped being sort of a collection of different pieces of writing and became, in my mind, a novel that was going to run to completion. I think, it's not, the story is not there without it. I think so much of and this links to what you just sort of said about identity, but so much of the novel interrogates the essential reality that our past informs our present, in a similar way in which we can't deny that being gay or being trans, though it may not defy the entirety of one's identity, is still a part of our identities that informs our existence and how we engage with the world around us in a way that we can't really deny, no matter how much we crave acceptance. And so, with Vincent, he goes on this gap year and bad things happen, you know, as you can sort of imagine. I think maybe the White Lotus season 3
I
is
know.
actually a very useful heuristic tool for readers of my book. And this is actually
I
very
know.
convenient
I was like,
to
it was so in
I
sync, and
know.
I was like,
With
I was like,
Kosamui as well, and they go to the full moon party, they go to the half moon party in my book, but it's, you know, basically the same thing. And I'm like, wow, what a great visual aid to
it was
illustrate the
amazing.
horrors of these Thailand chapters with Vincent. And, you know, I think I was very interested in this idea of self-censorship. I experienced this as a trans person, you know, in what ways do I sort of like try to hide, you know, pictures of what I looked like when I was a teenager, for example. To what extent am I editing aspects of my history so that I don't have to confront the person who I once was, who brings up in feelings in me which are negative. And I think that form of self-editing, and almost like the deletion of self insofar that it makes our present selves uncomfortable, is something that's actually seen across the board, often in some more malicious forms, as we see with Vincent. I think there's sort of this absence of confrontation between him and Fred in the years which have elapsed since this bad thing happened. They never address it. And it sort of festers, and he wants to run away from it. Almost, I think, say to himself, well, look how far I've come, particularly with this relationship with Max. He's like, but, you know, this is such a amazing sort of point of evidence for my
Mhm.
own personal growth. But at the same time, can you really say that you're moving forward when part of you is still chained to the past? And that process of unchaining necessarily involves a degree of confrontation that I think the characters aren't really willing to participate in, you know, to really, and you see that across the board, even with Max and her relationship with her father, who was an alcoholic when she was younger, and in adulthood is in recovery. But there's sort of instances from her childhood which it causes her too much pain to revisit, because these stories are ways for her to blame herself for the distance that she in adulthood feels from her father. I think these confrontations with the past are incredibly painful. They're something no one really likes to do, and yet they almost feel like a necessary part of making peace with oneself. And, you know, you can't run away forever. And I think that's what the human instinct propels us to do, is to run. And so in constructing the novel, I wanted to have these two timelines so that there could be an inevitable collision that forces these characters to do what they might not otherwise have done, which is to look back.
Yeah. And I think, like you were saying earlier, there's all of these characters in some ways are evading something,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not dealing with something head on, while also grappling. So many of the men in this, it's so much toxic masculinity. Even
Mm-hmm.
her brother, Max's brother, Jamie, who is,
Oh, Jamie.
I mean, he's such an interesting character, and I'm like, dude, you're gonna figure it out. I swear, you're gonna figure it out eventually. But poor thing. But
He's so close as well, I think.
he really is. He's like right on that cusp where you're like, let's just pull you over.
Yeah.
You almost see it, dude. You almost are there.
He's I think Jamie was such an interesting character to write, because this is what I love writing secondary characters. I think, you know, when I talk about my novels, I'm often stuck with talking about the protagonists of the novels, which tend to exist in pairs. But these secondary characters, I feel like, I like to give them lives of their own,
Mm,
and also have their lives sort of play into the bigger themes of the novel. And I think you see that with Max's brother Jamie, and also her best friend Simone, who are going
Simone.
through things which are cousins to the feelings that Max and Vincent are experiencing over the course of the novel. And, you know, Jamie is just he's so angry.
So
He's
angry.
holding in to all this anger, and he is so stuck in these very self-flagellating and anxious patterns of behavior, which completely trap him from any meaningful confrontation with, you know, what he needs to do to change. And I think we all know someone like that, and feel that
Oh,
sort of deep sense of frustration, if not for someone we know, if sometimes for ourselves.
do you have siblings?
Yeah, I'm the youngest of three.
How old is the oldest?
So I have two amazing older sisters. One is 6 years older than me, and one is 4 years older than me.
And you're all very close.
Very close. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, I'm the youngest. My sister, my oldest sister, is 72, and then 70, and then my brother's 64. So there's a huge spread. I'm 57. So there's a massive spread, right?
Wow.
And I'm the baby. So I didn't really grow up with my sisters. I only had my brother. And we didn't, my brother is very close to Jamie in a lot of ways. One of my favorite sequences in some of this was the old friends, that Max's old friends. And so when the girls get together, because one of them is getting married, and they all come together, and it's so wonderfully bitchy.
Max
I
and
mean,
Simone are so mean.
they're so mean, but it's so relatable, and I loved it. It's like literally like, that adage, like, if you don't have anything nice to say, come sit by me. And that's truly who they are. And so
Yeah.
that whole sequence made me laugh so hard. But all of these ancillary characters, and yeah, they're all great. Simone in particular, at times I was like, wow, this kitty has claws. But she's so much fun, and she's that ride or die friend, right? She will do anything for Max. She's there. It's like no questions asked. They're there, and they'll be brutally honest with each other as much as they can be. And she also, I just like the way she pushes Max a bit too, in situations that are potentially uncomfortable. And she's that friend.
What's so interesting about Simone and Max's friendship for me is that Simone does something in the novel which again which changes how Max sees her. And that's really strange and difficult for Max and destabilizing to see an old friend in a new light. And it's not completely out of Simone's character, but it's almost the part of Simone's character that Max gets to enjoy. But in this particular situation, she's unable to enjoy it because what Simone does is very out of kilter with Max's values. And it's sort of, I liked writing that friendship because although it's sort of like the enduring love story of the novel, it's like the relationship will last and stand the
Yes.
test of time beyond any romantic relationship that may enter or leave the women's lives. It's also a sort of an illustration of how people sort of continue to change and surprise us, and how we sort of deal with that and reconcile these new versions of these people with what we have with our existing impressions of them.
Yeah, 100%. Do you read poetry as well?
No, so I don't actually. I did try write more poetry for this book, and initially there were like way more poems in the novel, and they would sort of separate the chapters, and my agent was very nice about them. She was like, wow, these are quite good. My editor was like, Nicola, these have to go, these are not good poems. And they interrupt the flow of the novel. However, I was allowed to keep sort of the opening poem, which is actually just a very small collection of lines, which were initially part of a larger poem, and the last poem, which I'm really happy about. I
It's
think I
beautiful.
like that the book ends with a poem, and I don't think it's for everyone necessarily, but I'm a big fan of ambiguity in literature. I think it provides enough certainty for me. Like, I read it and I'm like, okay, I have a sense of what's going to happen or what has happened. But there's also a sense of which I don't ever want like really certain declarations of a happy ending or a sad
The
ending.
bow.
And I think, yeah, and that's because I don't think that's how life works. I think life is a series of happy endings and sad endings, and you can't guarantee happiness forever at any point in your life. And I think that is kind of what the novel is about. I think Max and Simone, even towards the end of the novel, have a conversation on this very topic. And,
Right.
there's a sense of, oh, I feel bad for sort of denying my reader's certainty. But I also think the thing I love as an author is knowing that when the reader puts the book down, that's when the conversation starts. And I like to leave room for that.
I'm so curious because you've had now 2 books, both dealing with trans women. I'm curious, as a trans writer, do you feel, whether it's been put on you or not, this sense of responsibility, or no? Is it simply like, look, I'm writing the stories I want to write? I'm just curious. Does that make
Uh,
sense?
yeah, no, definitely. I think I think what's interesting to me is like I am asked lots of questions about representation, not only on the trans front, but maybe for the broader queer community when people look at the cast of characters. And the cast of
Yeah.
characters in my novels tend to be quite racially diverse as well. But all
Yeah.
of this is just a factor of my own life. Like, I write trans characters because I'm trans and I find writing a trans character interesting. I have a diverse queer group of friends, and that's sort of reflected in my fiction because it's a reality that I find interesting because I find my own life interesting. And
Yeah.
so, there's sort of a freedom that comes with that. And that when I'm initially engaging in the process of writing, I'm not thinking too much about the politics of the way which I'm representing characters, which I think is the right way to do it. I think, look, with fiction, like, your fiction meets people where they are.
Yeah.
If someone, firstly, I just don't think anyone who has no inclination towards believing in the autonomy and freedom of trans people is going to be like, this is the book for me. Firstly, I think there's
This is our
already
book
like
club this month.
there's sort of like an openness which probably already comes from picking up a book like mine. I know that with that openness usually comes a willingness to see the characters I'm writing as human. And so even if they're sort of distasteful, unlikable, whatever, I think I like to be generous to my reader in assuming that they'll be able to disentangle the fact that those negative qualities are not necessarily intrinsically linked or necessarily linked to the fact that they're trans. I
Sure.
don't think anything I write is necessarily like an ammo for transphobes. And if it was, then that's on the basis of a pretty bad faith reading of my work. And I can't cater to people who will read my work in bad faith because I don't write books for them.
Yeah, 100%. That makes sense. It's funny. I had a writer on named Emily St. James, and she wrote this book called Woodworking. You might have seen it, but it's interesting because I was talking to her about you and Bellies, and Now Disappoint Me, because I said Bellies and Woodworking were two books that I would give anyone who was just even questioning in an open mind, like just even say, I don't understand the experience of what it's like for someone who is facing the idea that they may want to transition. And those two books are kind of in conversation with each other about two individuals who are facing this thing and the choices they make and what it feels like and kind of the ins and outs and the repercussions about with everyone around it. So that's what just made me think about it. But again, what I love about both your books, they're just they're not what I would term as trans stories per se.
Mm-hmm.
They're stories that have trans characters. Clearly in Bellies, it's a much more kind of driving force in the beginning. But Disappoint Me to me is just about these characters. And
Mm-hmm.
this character happens to be trans the same way this character happens to be Asian, and this character's gay, or this character's white, or whatever it is. And that's what makes both books resonate so much with me. They're just really interesting, really engaging characters who have needs and wants and are fucked up at times and do stupid shit like everyone does. It's just life. And that's why I think they're not didactic. They're not trying to, as you said earlier, it's not political. It's just, this is life. And that's why I think they're amazing.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense, it's I agree with you. It's sort of not political in that sense, but inevitably is sort of political. And I think,
I know.
the ways, um, I think something that presents as relatively apolitical, like a novel like this, can still affect political change. Because I think if you want to understand how a trans person lives, I don't think that comes from reading a pamphlet. I think it comes from engaging intimately with the life of a trans person. And I think maybe that's what a book like Disappoint Me offers. And so there's sort of I don't think I can escape the question of politics, particularly in the current climate. And, to speak more broadly on fiction, I think what I love about fiction is that I think good fiction does two things, and that it sort of aims at specificity, but universality both
Mm-hmm.
at once. I don't think there's true universality to any experience, but what I at least what I'm trying to get at by that is, I'm presenting a very specific set of circumstances. with respect to a trans character, the transness doesn't define her, but it is still a very important factor for how she navigates a heterosexual relationship, particularly when there are questions of things like marriage and children, and traditionalism. But it's still, despite that very sort of specific lens, I think it's still offering maybe more universal questions, speaking to more universal feelings than would necessarily be expected by reading the profile, by one person reading the profile of this character that I've written. And I think, that's how we connect to one another. But I think, I don't think this is controversial of me to say, but I think, as we've sort of become a little bit more educated on different people's lived experiences, there's almost been an inclination to say to people, oh, I will never understand what that's like for you, almost as a way of honoring their life experiences. And I can see where that comes from. And I think it comes from a really good place. At the same time, part of me sometimes as a trans person is, I'm like, but you can sort of understand what this is like to me. Here, read my book. But also,
Right.
there's a sense of if you really engage and you connect with someone and you try to find points of commonality, there are so many ways for you to attain a certain level of understanding and for their experiences. I don't think saying, oh, I can't understand what that's like for you is necessarily helpful. If anything, it can be quite alienating. And I think we should embrace our ability to understand one another, not necessarily to the full degree of actually experiencing ourselves, but through these more universal feelings, points of contact with people who are not like us.
100%. 100%. That is such a great place to stop, but I have to ask you two more things really quick. The first is both of your books deal so much with food and making food and these characters and Max and this. Is that a huge thing for you? Are you a big foodie? And did you cook?
So I do cook, but I think my love of food comes from the fact that I'm Malaysian and, I was born in Hong Kong, a culture that's hugely obsessed with food. Malaysia as well, hugely obsessed with food. And so I often find myself reading novels that will have a meal scene. And I'm like, why is the author not describing what they're eating? Like that is very important setting information to me to know what's on the table. It's sort of, I'm sadly one of those people where if you tell me a story of something dramatic that happened at dinner, I will ask, what were you eating? Because it just does so much to add atmosphere for me. And so I find myself writing about food a lot for that reason, but also because I think so much of my novels are centered on intimacy, situations in which people feel comfortable to be intimate with one another, to have difficult conversations. And one of those settings in which those conversations naturally happen are meal times. Like that's when people sit down with one another and talk. And so, I write food because it's a means to bring people together in the context of a novel in a similar way to which like sex operates similarly. Characters have sex and they're able to be more emotionally vulnerable once they've achieved this level of physical intimacy. And so I think that's sort of the reason it's a useful tool, but I'm also not going to not describe the food.
It also just makes me think like I've always found going to anyone's house for a dinner party or whatever, people always seem to generate towards the kitchen naturally. And there's just that thing of someone chopping and everyone standing around with their wine glass.
Absolutely.
And it speaks to so much of this. Last thing, this is just a sidebar. What's happening with the Bellies series?
It's not
Where is it at?
happening.
It's not?
No. So, I mean, as I'm sure you'll know from conversations with authors or just, being in the world, like TV's in a really bad spot. And I think
Yeah, no, it's
what's so
terrible.
interesting is that there was so much excitement when we were selling the rights to Bellies 3 years ago. I've never, my film and TV agent was like, I've never experienced this level of interest for something. And then it seemed within the 2 years after that everything sort of slowly fell apart because the tone of projects that the industry was willing to take on in what felt like a riskier environment, not just politically, but also in terms of like what will bring in viewers, meant that sort of these slow relationship dramas weren't going to get commissioned. And so, unless I'm not going to add a murder or an alien or a dragon to Bellies. And unfortunately, my options are up. But, I hope that with time, maybe there'll be reignited interest when the conditions change. And also there are other exciting things going on because the TV show isn't happening. It means that the theatre project, the theatre adaptation with Bellies might be able to go ahead. And
Oh,
so I
wow.
think, with this industry, it's important to not focus too much on what can feel like huge amounts of loss and just be thinking about, opportunities for different creative projects. And it's why I love writing novels so much, because I don't feel at the mercy of industry conditions as extremely as I do when it concerned the TV adaptation, where so much was out of my hands. What's amazing about writing is that I can just always write. It's such a low
Right.
it's such like a low barriers to entry profession to have. All you really need is a pen and paper, and I don't think a lot of jobs can say that.
No, no. And you're absolutely right. I mean, you're helming your own ship in this way. And but that's a bummer, only because I was like, oh my God, that creative team. And I thought that they did such a terrific job with normal
Yeah, and
people. Yes.
they're amazing. I got so much out of the experience, and yeah, I have some quiet hopes for the future for it, but for now, we're on to the next thing.
Well, and like you said, like, listen, you're completely prolific at this point. And like you've opened up this creative floodgate where it's all just coming through. And I love that so much. And wait, is your next book sci-fi? Is that what I heard?
So you're not allowed to call it sci-fi because the sci-fi people come for you. So
Okay.
you call it
Speculative?
speculative.
Yes,
Yes,
there we go.
exactly. You call it speculative. So it's a speculative novel set in 1980s Hong Kong that follows two Chinese employees of a major airline who are given the strange task of collecting the used cigarette butts of first class passengers for a secret project in which their British barrister husbands are implicated. So it's sort of like
Oh,
a juicy mystery set in the very glamorous 1980s.
wow. That sounds amazing.
Thank you.
So something to look forward to.
Yeah,
Well, I could talk to you literally all day. This was such a delight. Thank you so
thank
much
you.
for being here and sharing so much insight. Please, everyone, get the book. It is so, 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 so good. I'm curious too to hear the audio. I mean, having listened to Bellies, I know it's
It's
completely
so
different
good.
readers.
The
Yeah.
audio is,
So
I'm so proud of it. I don't
it,
narrate it, obviously, but I'm really proud of the actors.
I know there was a part of me that almost would have loved to hear you narrate some of it. I would just love to have heard your spin on Max's dialogue. But it is so good, you guys. And please buy independent if you are able to buy independent.
Yep.
But again, thank you for being here and good luck with all of this. I'm so excited for you.
Thank you, Brett.